We begin this hour with another reason to resist, an economy that is increasingly not working for working Americans in a country that is run by a real estate developer who's populated his cabinet with billionaires. I want to zoom in specifically on the housing crisis in this country because its causes are complex and its consequences are dire. Last week, you'll remember I told you the story of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a vast open landscape nestled beneath towering mountains, founded and built by working people who were driven by grit, ambition, and an entrepreneurial spirit. And I told you that despite those roots, the people who sustain Jackson Hole today, the workers, can no longer afford to live there. Some are living in their cars just to stay close to their jobs. And importantly, Jackson Hole is not an anomaly. It's a national malady, driven in large part by land use regulations and zoning laws that effectively shut working people out from living where they work. So I want to go even farther back in America's story this morning, because America's story is literally the story of movement, of mobility, of people leaving behind what they knew, of crossing oceans and crossing rivers and forests and state lines, chasing something better, opportunity, work, a future, a new life. That restless pursuit has always been the fuel of the American dream. Millions of people moving, building, striving. As the historian and writer Yoni Appelbaum puts it in The Atlantic, quote, "The idea that people should be able to choose their own communities instead of being stuck where they are born is a distinctly American innovation. It is the foundation for the country's prosperity and democracy, and it may be America's most profound contribution to the world," end quote. Well, today that foundation has largely collapsed. And the fuel that once powered that movement, affordable housing, is now out of reach for millions of working Americans. And that part that is so often misunderstood in this conversation is the why. We talk about markets, we talk about interest rates, we talk about inflation, we talk about corporate landlords, but the major driver of American housing costs is much, 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 much closer to home. Decisions about where affordable housing gets built are ultimately hyper-local. They are made city by city, block by block, through zoning laws and land use rules that determine what can be built, where it can be built, and ultimately who gets to live where. For decades, many American cities have made it effectively illegal to build the kinds of homes that working families can actually afford to live in, to buy, and to rent. Instead, vast areas with very strong labor markets and good schools have been locked into single-family zoning, freezing neighborhoods in place while demand continues to grow. And when you restrict housing supply like that, prices don't just rise, they spike a lot. Because now you've got more people chasing fewer homes. And the result is that housing costs continue to rise faster than incomes do, putting enormous pressure on working families. You know, I'm a financial journalist. There's a rule of thumb that says, it's a 30% rule. It says that a household is considered to be unduly cost burdened if it spends more than 30% of its income on housing. 30%. Think about that. Do a little quick math. Right now, millions of Americans spend far more than 30% of their income on housing. I would imagine in a place like New York City, it's 40, 50, perhaps 60% of people's income that they spend on housing. We see the consequences of that everywhere. According to my next guest, the housing economist Jenny Schuetz, quote, "Where people can afford to live has important implications. Research shows that children who grow up in high opportunity communities have better economic outcomes as adults because housing near jobs and transit centers is so expensive. Low and moderate income people are pushed to cheaper housing on the outskirts of metropolitan areas, requiring them to spend more time and money commuting," end quote. That's how you end up in a country where a teacher, a nurse, a firefighter, people who are essential to a community can no longer afford to live in the very communities that they serve. This is how you end up in a country with workers commuting hours each day, pushed farther and farther from the job centers. This is how you get into a country where you get what experts call the missing middle, a hollowed out housing market where only the very wealthy or the very poor can find a place to live and everyone else is squeezed out. For historians like Yoni Appelbaum, the housing crisis is at the core of mobility because for most of American history, people moved toward opportunity, toward better jobs, toward better schools, toward a better life. Today, more and more Americans are stuck, not because they lack the will to move, they simply cannot afford to move. And when people can't move, everything else about this dynamic economy begins to collapse. Economic opportunity narrows. Communities become more segregated economically and quite often racially. That sense of possibility, the very American belief that you can start over somewhere new, begins to erode. Crucially, American migration didn't just shape our economy, it shaped who we are as a people. It made us open, more pluralistic. As Yoni Applebaum beautifully captures, the term stranger, which is synonymous with danger in other lands, instead became a common form of friendly salutation in America. Quote, in a nation where people are forever arriving and departing, a newcomer can seem less like a threat than a welcome addition. Howdy, stranger. Entrepreneurship, innovation, growth, social equality, the most appealing features of the young republic, all traced back to this foundational fact. Americans were always looking ahead to their next beginning, always seeking to move up by moving on, end quote. Now, here's the part where the conversation most often goes off track, because when people hear housing crisis, they look to Washington. They expect a sweeping federal fix. But this is not actually a problem that can be solved from Washington, because these rules, the ones that determine what gets built and where, they're not written in Washington. They're written in city halls, in county commissions, in local planning boards, which means the solution to the housing crisis has got to be local. Doesn't mean the federal government has no role. The federal government has an important role. It can provide incentives. It can provide funding. It can provide guidance. But Washington cannot rewrite the zoning code of a neighborhood in Charlotte or a town in Montana. And yet, too often, what we get instead are political talking points, big sweeping promises by presidential candidates that never actually reach the root of the problem. The bottom line is simple. We've made it too hard to build homes in the places that people most need and want to live. Now, there are signs that some places are beginning to confront this reality. In Montana, I just mentioned, for example, lawmakers passed bipartisan reforms to allow more housing, include higher density development, and fewer restrictions on what can be built. And just this week, that state's Supreme Court upheld those laws, making clear that while public input does matter, it cannot be used as a blanket veto to block new housing altogether. And that is a critical point, because for too long, this process has been dominated by a narrow set of voices. Often homeowners who already have access to these high opportunity communities and have zero incentive to share that access. This NIMBY mindset, not in my backyard, that in practice keeps everyone else out. The everyone else are people who actually need affordable housing. At its core, this is a question of who gets a say, because zoning isn't a technical exercise. It's actually a democratic exercise. These decisions are rooted in power. Who gets to shape a community? Who gets shut out of that community? Other states are also beginning to act. Virginia, where lawmakers are advancing housing near jobs proposals that would allow apartment buildings, townhomes, and mixed-use developments to be built in commercial corridors without a lengthy approval process. The goal is to cut through years of delays and make it easier to build the kind of housing that teachers and firefighters and service workers can actually afford near where they actually work. In North Carolina, lawmakers are taking aim at another hidden driver of housing costs. Believe it or not, parking mandates. A bipartisan bill that cleared unanimously in the state house last month would stop cities from requiring developers to build costly parking spaces, rules that can add thousands of dollars per unit and ultimately drive rents higher. But of course, that depends on having a good public transit infrastructure. The idea of fixing this is real, but the reforms that are needed come from local homeowners who are concerned about the characters of their neighborhoods. And those concerns can be valid. But when they become a reason to block nearly all new housing, the result ends up being exclusion. The result is economic segregation, when only those who can afford the price of entry are allowed in.